Picture this. The sun is sliding down over the Ionian Sea, that particular honey gold light that makes everything in Greece look like a memory instead of a place. A small boat moves quietly over the water, its engine a low hum, its wake barely disturbing the surface. Ahead, an island rises out of the blue, lush and improbably green, like someone dropped a piece of a different world into the middle of the sea. You see a chapel on a hill, white against the dark cypress trees, a winding road, a long private beach with sand that looks almost too perfect. And tucked into the slopes, hidden behind pines and oleanders, there are villas, mansions really, terraces facing the horizon, empty loungers by silent pools, shutters closed against a breeze that once blew cigarette smoke and laughter across this same water. If you didn't know better, you might think this was just an expensive resort under construction, another playground for the ultra-rich. But this island has a name that once made the world lean closer to its radios and newsstands: Skorpios. And for a few decades, Skorpios was more than just real estate. It was a kingdom built by one man, a man who believed there was nothing he couldn't buy, shape, or bend to his will. Aristotle Onassis took a rocky little Greek island and turned it into his private utopia, a stage where he could host presidents, princesses, movie stars, opera divas, and the most famous widow on earth. But if you walk that island now, if you stand near the little family cemetery where the marble crosses face the sea, you don't feel power. You feel something else, something heavy, a kind of echo. Because the story of Skorpios is not really a story about mansions or parties or wealth beyond imagination. It's the story of a family that seemed to have everything and somehow lost almost all of it. A family that built a paradise on an island, only to watch that paradise become a mausoleum for their dreams. And eventually, a luxury asset passed from one stranger to another. And the strange part is this: the more you study what happened on Skorpios, the more it stops feeling like some remote billionaire soap opera. It starts to feel like a magnified version of things we all deal with: ambition and insecurity, parents and children who never really understand each other, grief that money can't soften, and the way a place can hold on to feelings long after the people who created them are gone. So let's go back, before the empty villas and the construction cranes, before the Russian billionaire, before the discreet security guards and the offshore companies. Let's go back to when Skorpios was just a patch of land in the Ionian Sea, almost nobody's dream, and meet the man who decided to claim it, and in doing that, set off a chain of events that money couldn't control. Once, Skorpios wasn't glamorous at all. It was just an island off the western coast of Greece, near Lefkada, stony and wild. If you'd sailed past it, in the early 20th century, you wouldn't have seen green. You'd have seen bare rock, low scrub, and a few stubborn goats picking their way along the slopes. No villas, no desalination plants, no helipads, just sea, stone, and a silence that belonged to fishermen and birds. It took a particular kind of eye to look at that rough little island and see possibility, not inconvenience. And Aristotle Onassis had that eye. He'd trained it on himself first. He wasn't born into the kind of wealth that ends up buying islands. He was born into chaos, in a city that would burn. Smyrna, on the coast of Asia Minor, a place where Greeks had lived for centuries, a place of trade and cultures colliding. Then came war, fire, and catastrophe. The disaster that drove hundreds of thousands of Greeks from their homes also drove a young Onassis into exile, carrying almost nothing with him. The world he'd known vanished into smoke. There's something important there, at the root of this story. When someone loses everything young, they learn a cruel lesson. Nothing is guaranteed. The ground can disappear under your feet. And some people, after that, just want safety, security. Enough. But others decide that if the ground can vanish anyway, they might as well aim for the sky. Onassis went to Argentina, and the details of those early years are half legend, half truth. The cigarette factory, the hustle, the deals made in smoky rooms with men who didn't care about his accent or his past, only his nerve. He realized quickly that the world of ships was where the big plays were made. Cargo had to move. Nations needed oil. If you could get the ships, you could get a piece of the invisible machinery that kept the modern world turning. He was not the most respectable man in shipping. He was not the most polite, but he was possibly the boldest. Buying ships when others thought the timing was all wrong, registering them under flags of convenience before that term was even widely used, making money in ways that were creative, sometimes questionable, but undeniably effective. A refugee became a tycoon. Imagine the psychological whiplash of that. You go from watching your city burn to standing on the bridge of a ship that answers to you. You go from being pushed out of your homeland to being the man who arrives back in your country on a yacht longer than the key. All of that does something to a person's sense of reality, to their sense of limits. For Onassis, the world became a set of doors that could be opened with enough determination, charm, and money. And one day, one of those doors was marked Skorpios. By the time he found the island, he already had his legendary yacht, the Christina, named after his daughter. He already moved in the floating world of the ultra-rich, harbor to harbor, port to port, glittering decks and white uniforms, conversations that decided deals worth more than most people would see in 100 lifetimes. But there's only so much privacy you can have on a yacht, only so much control when you're still in someone else's waters. An island is different. An island is a kingdom with natural borders. You control who steps on the sand. You control who sees the lights in your windows at night. You can build a world there that answers to you, not to any landlord, not to hotel staff, not to a government inspector wandering down a public road. So when the chance came to buy a neglected rocky island near Lefkada, Onassis took it. The price, by the standards of what it would become, was almost comically low. But that's the thing about vision. The world only respects it in hindsight. At the time, it probably looked like he was buying himself a headache. He didn't see a headache. He saw Skorpios as clay, and he was ready to be the sculptor. What happens next is one of those transformations that, if you didn't have photos, would sound exaggerated. He brought in engineers and workers. He didn't just build houses, he changed the land itself. A private desalination plant, so fresh water would never be a problem. Forests of trees brought from elsewhere and planted in the rocky soil. Tons of sand, shipped in to create beaches where there had only been stone. Paths, roads, utilities, all quietly stitched into the island's veins. Think for a moment about the mindset behind that. This is a man who had watched history tear apart lands that seemed eternal. And now, on Skorpios, he's doing the opposite, forcing barren rock into the shape of a permanent home. At least, that was the idea. While Skorpios was being remade, so was his personal life, in ways that the world followed with a mix of fascination and disapproval. He was married with children. He was also in a passionate, complicated relationship with Maria Callas, the great opera singer, a woman whose voice could fill an opera house and whose presence could fill every photograph she was in. Their love affair was volcanic, glamorous, destructive. And around them, always, there was that Greek sun, that blue sea, and the growing myth of Onassis as a man for whom ordinary rules did not apply. But Skorpios would become famous not because of Callas, but because of someone else, a woman who had already lived through her own version of the global gaze, grief, and reinvention, Jacqueline Kennedy. By the time Jackie came into Onassis's life, she was not just a woman or even just a former first lady. She was an icon. She had stood beside a president, endured the shock of his assassination, walked behind the coffin in that black veil with a little boy saluting his father's casket. The whole world had watched that, and in some strange, intrusive way, felt that they owned a piece of her grief. Imagine, for a second, what that does to a person. Everyone thinks they know your story. Everyone has an opinion about what you owe to your husband's memory, to your children, to your country. And you are still young, still alive, still trying to figure out who you are when the cameras aren't there. Onassis offered Jackie something she hadn't had in years: control, privacy, the ability to disappear from the public eye onto a yacht or, eventually, onto an island where even long lenses could only catch the outline of a figure walking along a beach. Their marriage on Skorpios turned the island from a private project into a global headline. Suddenly, this little spot on a Greek map was the place where a narrative many people did not want to accept took a sharp, unexpected turn. The widow of an American president remarried to a Greek shipping magnate on his own private island. People were outraged, others were fascinated, some quietly understood. But for Skorpios, the effect was clear. Its name became shorthand for another one of those worlds most people would only ever see on magazine covers. The wedding itself was relatively small, by the standards of who was involved, but it was swarmed by boats carrying journalists and photographers. Security did what it could, pushing back reporters, controlling access. Inside the island, away from the frenzy at the shore, a ceremony took place in the little chapel, marble and icons, candles quivering in the breeze. If you stood back, you would have seen layers of history pressing into that moment. A man who had fled fire and exile, now giving a ring to a woman who had walked through the fire of global tragedy. Their families, their worlds, their reputations all balanced on that small piece of land. And looking on, somewhere, were two children who had not chosen any of this, Alexander and Christina. To the outside world, they were the children of one of the richest men on earth, heirs to a fortune made of steel and oil, of ports and tankers and charter contracts. They had a playground others could barely imagine, a yacht that was practically a palace, a private island where they could ride horses, swim in secluded bays, and get bored of views that most people dream about. But money doesn't cancel out family dynamics. If anything, it amplifies them. Onassis was a man obsessed with control and success. He worked relentlessly. He negotiated hard. He expected excellence and loyalty, and he was not always gentle in the way he expressed that. That kind of personality can build empires. It can also be difficult to grow up with. Alexander, the son, was expected to be the natural heir. He was named after one of history's great conquerors, after all. Yet, like many sons of very powerful fathers, he grew up in a shadow that was hard to escape. Imagine being young and knowing that the world already has a script it expects you to follow. You will learn the business, you will become the prince of this empire, you will sail your father's yacht into the next generation. But Alexander had his own passions. He loved flying. The sense of freedom that comes with being in the air, away from the decks and engine rooms, away from the sea that had defined his father's fortune. An airplane is its own little world, but it isn't owned in the same way a ship is. Up there, in the cockpit, you are not the heir. You are the pilot. There's something symbolic there, almost too neat, the son of the shipping magnate who found his joy not on the water, but in the sky. The boy expected to inherit the fleet, choosing the clouds instead. Christina, the daughter, also grew up under the weight of expectations. Bright, sharp, often blunt, she saw the cracks in the glamorous facade earlier than most. She saw how her father's affairs, his public image, his habits, collided with the more delicate needs of his family. She saw how money attracted people who did not always have pure intentions, and she developed, according to many who knew her, a kind of restless skepticism. There's a line people love to throw around: money can't buy happiness. It's a cliché, often said by people who would, quite reasonably, love to have a bit more money. But when you look at the Onassis family, you see a harsher version of that idea. Money can sometimes make unhappiness heavier because it removes the illusion that, if only we had more, things would be better. On Skorpios, during those golden years, that tension was always there under the surface. You can imagine the scenes. On a summer evening, the main villa lit up, music playing, guests arriving off small boats from the Christina or from the mainland. Jackie, in sunglasses even at dusk, gliding past reporters and into the sanctuary of the island. Famous actors, politicians, Greek elites, business rivals all gathering under the pergolas, laughing over drinks, posing for photos. And somewhere nearby, maybe on a quieter terrace, Alexander and Christina watching all this, part of it and yet not really. The island was their home in a way it would never be for the guests. They knew the paths through the trees, the best spots to swim, the places to go when you wanted to be away from everyone. For them, Skorpios wasn't a headline. It was just where they went in the summer, where their father sometimes seemed relaxed, happy, almost playful, and sometimes seemed distracted, absorbed by thoughts of deals and contracts and private worries nobody else was allowed to see. We talk about houses having souls, holding memories, absorbing the emotions of the people who live in them. Now, multiply that by an island. Every argument that ended with slammed doors in those villas. Every late-night conversation by the pool when someone admitted they were lonely or scared or tired of the constant scrutiny. Every quiet walk to the little cemetery where Onassis's parents would later be buried. The sea always there, waves whispering at the edges of the island. Skorpios was both paradise and pressure cooker. From the outside, everything looked perfect. The patriarch was at the height of his power. The island was flourishing, green now, instead of barren. The guest lists read like a who's who of the 20th century. But the first cracks were already forming. The marriage to Jackie was not a fairy tale. She found, as time went on, that the privacy Skorpios and the Christina offered came at a cost. Onassis was not an easy man to be married to. There were constant demands on his time and attention. There were old flames, like Callus, hovering in the background, still wounded, still bitter. There was the fact that Jackie's presence, which had once drawn admiring curiosity, also drew criticism, especially from those who felt she had betrayed some unspoken duty to remain a certain kind of widow forever. Inside the family, there were resentments, children who felt sidelined, a father who saw his decisions as strategic moves, not realizing how deeply personal they felt to his loved ones. The island that was supposed to be their sanctuary sometimes became the place where all those tensions surfaced, because there, at last, they were out of the public eye and free to say the things they swallowed in front of cameras. But the real turning point, the moment when the story of Skorpios shifted from a tale of ambition to a tragedy, didn't happen on the island. It happened in the sky. Alexander, as we said, loved flying. He became a pilot, logging hours, learning the mechanics and the instincts you need to trust yourself up there. His father, like many strong-willed parents, had mixed feelings about this. On one hand, he respected the competence it took. On the other, he wanted his son rooted in the shipping business, not off in the clouds. Still, Alexander flew. It was his passion, his escape. Then came the crash. The details can be recited like lines from a terrible script, a routine flight, an aircraft that should have completed the trip without incident, an accident that ended with Alexander terribly injured. In some tellings, there were questions about maintenance, about the role of the crew, about politics even. But in the end, what mattered most was that a young man who took off expecting to land casually and go on with his day instead found his life shattered in a matter of seconds. He did not die instantly. That almost makes it worse. There were days of waiting, of frantic trips to the hospital, of phone calls and doctors, and the dreadful hope that maybe, somehow, he would pull through. Onassis, the man who had stared down governments, who had outmaneuvered rivals, who had believed in his ability to fix by or overpower obstacles, suddenly found himself in a situation where none of that mattered. It didn't matter how many ships he owned. It didn't matter how much money he had in banks or in assets around the world. His son was dying, and he was powerless. For a man like that, the realization that there is absolutely nothing you can do is not just heartbreaking, it's identity-shattering. When Alexander died, something in Onassis broke. People who saw him after that said he was never the same. His shoulders sagged, a little. The spark that had driven him through decades of ruthless ambition dimmed. He still conducted business, still made calls, still moved through the world as the great Aristotle Onassis. But inside, the narrative that had sustained him, the story he told himself about being the man who could always find a way, had been permanently damaged. Now, remember Skorpios in this context. It wasn't just some place with pretty villas. It was the island where he had imagined his legacy unfolding. He might have pictured Alexander one day welcoming guests to the main house, overseeing the staff, guiding his own children along the same paths through the trees. He might have imagined himself old, sitting on a terrace watching his grandchildren splash in the pool, secure in the knowledge that the dynasty was firmly anchored. Instead, he had to live with the thought that the island was now a monument to a future that would never happen. One of the cruelest aspects of grief is the way it attaches itself to places: a bedroom where someone slept, a chair at the table where they used to sit, a flight path they used to take. For Onassis, Skorpios, with all its beauty, was also a haunted place now. Not in the ghost story sense, but in the way every corner held a memory of what might have been. His health declined. Stress, age, grief, all piling up. He was not an old man by modern standards when his body began to fail, but he felt older than his years. The empire needed management, decisions, strategies, and the heir he'd been grooming was gone. That left Christina. If you want to understand the tragic core of the Onassis story, you have to look closely at Christina. Born into wealth, yes, but also born into a family already complicated by her father's infidelities and ambitions. Growing up in the glare of scrutiny, always aware that people were watching, judging, calculating. Intelligent enough to see through the flattery, sensitive enough to feel the fractures beneath the surface. She loved her father, but their relationship was not simple. She confronted him about his affairs, particularly about Callis. She rejected the idea that she should quietly accept whatever he did because he was the patriarch. That level of honesty, in a world built on appearances, is admirable. It's also painful. When Alexander died, Christina lost not just a brother, but an ally. Someone who understood the unique position they were both in. Someone who shared the strange burden of being the children of Aristotle Onassis. Then, only a few years later, she lost her father too. When Onassis died, he left behind more than ships, stocks, and properties. He left behind unresolved emotions, complicated loyalties, and a family structure that had never been stable. He also left behind Skorpios, the island he had transformed, the island where his parents and his beloved son were buried, the island that was, in some sense, the physical embodiment of his desire to control his fate. And control of Skorpios passed to a young woman already carrying more weight than most people can imagine. Think about what it feels like to inherit not just wealth, but a story. Every eye on you, wondering, will she continue his legacy? Will she be responsible? Will she blow it? Will she marry wisely? Will she disgrace the name? People who had spent years flattering her father now turned their attention to her, often with their own agendas. Christina's life in the years after her father's death was marked by attempts to find something like steady ground. She married and divorced. She struggled with her health. She turned at times to substances and behaviors that suggested a deep, unresolved pain. She tried to use her wealth to do some good, donating and supporting causes, but the tabloids were more interested in her love life and her weight than her philanthropy. Skorpios for her was complicated. It was her father's creation, the place where so many memories were stored. Going there meant confronting all of that at once. The graves, the house where she'd seen her parents fight, where she'd watched famous guests drink and laugh while she sensed the tensions beneath. The beaches where she and Alexander had played before the world became more tragic. Sometimes, people think that if they just had enough money, life would automatically be easier. And in many practical ways, that's true. Bills are paid, opportunities are open, help is available. But money also gives you the freedom to isolate your pain, to wrap yourself in cocoons of luxury where nobody tells you no, where your loneliness has room to grow in silence. Christina never became the stable matriarch of a great dynasty. She couldn't. She was barely given the chance to heal from one loss before the next came. The narrative of the powerful Onassis family continuing, generation after generation, with Skorpios as the ancestral seat, never really took shape. Instead, the story bent toward another loss. Christina died young, not in a plane crash like her brother, but still too early, with her health undermined by stress, grief, and the pressures of carrying a burden that had never really fit her. When she died, the empire she inherited, reshaped, and sometimes arguably mismanaged, passed to her only child, Athena. Now imagine this. You are a child, brought up mostly far away from Greece, in Switzerland and France, in a world of boarding schools and carefully managed media exposure. You never really knew your grandfather. You lost your mother when you were still young. The adults around you are not uncles and aunts, but lawyers and trustees, family in name, but in reality people with their own interpretations of what is best for you and for the fortune you carry. You have an island, technically. At least, your name is attached to it. Skorpios is part of the portfolio, but it is, in many ways, more your grandfather's memory than your own. You know the stories. You see the photos. You hear the way older Greeks talk about the Onassis name, with a mix of pride, resentment, nostalgia, and curiosity. You know there is a small cemetery on Skorpios where your family lies, but you don't have the decades of personal history that bind you to that land the way they were bound. Athena grew up in the long shadow of a man she never met. She was the heiress not just to money, but to an idea of the Onassis name that millions of people had built up in their heads over years of headlines. And, like many people who inherit something they didn't personally build, she had to figure out who she was separate from that myth. From the outside, it might seem simple. Keep the island. Visit often. Honor the legacy. But real life is rarely that neat. Skorpios is not just a sentimental family cottage. It is an asset that costs enormous sums to maintain. It requires staff, security, infrastructure. Every tree, every road, every building needs upkeep. And because of its history, every decision about it is scrutinized. Do you, as a young woman trying to carve out your own identity, want to spend your life tending the garden of someone else's dream? Or do you want to be free to make choices that serve your own goals, your own sense of home? Athena, over time, gravitated away from the Greek identity that strangers wanted to impose on her. She spoke other languages more than Greek. She built a life in a different world, in equestrian circles, in relationships and activities that had nothing to do with ships or islands. For many Greeks, this was almost a betrayal. How could she not feel Greek? How could she not feel bound to Skorpios? But again, think emotionally, not romantically. How strong can your attachment be to a place you barely knew as a child, especially when that place is also a magnet for the press, for endless commentary, for people wanting to project their hopes and disappointments onto you? Meanwhile, Skorpios itself was aging. The trees Onassis had planted kept growing, reaching the sky, thickening the shade. The villas, once avant-garde in their luxury, now needed renovation to meet modern standards of comfort and security. The system's water, electricity, communication needed upgrades. Some of the original staff grew old and retired, others passed away. The island's glory days faded into sepia-toned memory, but the graves remained. That small cemetery on Skorpios is the emotional heart of the story. 3 white crosses looking out over the water: Alexander, Christina, Aristotle. The man who built the island and the 2 people whose deaths ensured that the dynasty would never be what he'd imagined. For years, the island remained under the control of the Onassis family trusts, more symbol than living home. Occasional visits, occasional photos in magazines showing a distant figure on a horse or a yacht anchored offshore. But the energy had shifted. Skorpios was like a grand house whose owners had moved away, leaving it in the care of caretakers and memories. Eventually, the practical question became impossible to ignore. What do you do with an island like this when the family no longer truly lives there and the weight of its past makes it more mausoleum than retreat? The answer, from a strictly financial point of view, is obvious. You sell. Or, if local laws make that complicated, you lease. You convert the emotional into the transactional, and that is what happened. Skorpios moved, effectively, into new hands. A billionaire from another part of the world, attracted by the uniqueness of the island and its potential as a high-end destination, stepped in. Contracts were signed, control shifted. The Onassis name remained on the cemetery stones, on the lips of locals reminiscing about the old days. But in practical terms, the island became a project again, much as it had been when Onassis himself first bought it. Only this time, the vision was different. Where Onassis had built Skorpios as a private kingdom, the new era framed it as something that could, at least partially, be shared with paying guests. Plans for exclusive resorts, villas you could rent for staggering sums, wellness centers, conference venues for the ultra-wealthy. The kind of place where money still buys privacy, but under the logic of hospitality, not family life. To the world of high finance and luxury hospitality, this transition made perfect sense. Assets like Skorpios are rare, and rare things can be monetized spectacularly. To many Greeks, and to those who grew up with the myth of Onassis, it felt like a kind of betrayal. The island that had once been a symbol of Greek success now seemed to belong to someone else entirely, its future tied up in foreign investment and tourism strategies. And hanging over all of it, quiet and unchanging, the family cemetery. That little patch of ground is where the emotional truth of the story settles. Onassis, who fled a burning city, who built a shipping empire and a private island, lies in the soil of Skorpios, the island he sculpted to his will. His son, who loved the sky more than the sea, lies beside him, pulled from the air and returned to earth. His daughter, who struggled under the weight of the name she inherited, lies there too. They had everything and lost everything, people like to say. It's not literally true. The family left behind money, of course, and some influence, and photographs that will continue to circulate as long as people are fascinated by wealth and tragedy. But as a family line rooted in a place, as a dynasty with a stable home, they did, in a way, lose almost everything that mattered on a human level. The mansions on Skorpios are beautiful. Terraces with views that can stop your breath, pools that mirror the skiing, interiors that once saw Jackie in her sandals and sunglasses, Callus with her dramatic presence, heads of state loosening their ties after formal meetings elsewhere. But beauty does not protect you from grief. Marble floors echo just as loudly when footsteps disappear. And no amount of polished wood or imported sand can turn an island into something it was never really allowed to become, a peaceful, ordinary family home. There's a sad irony in that. Onassis wanted permanence. He had seen the opposite: fire, exile, instability. Skorpios was his answer to that, his attempt to put roots down so deep that nothing could rip them out. He changed the land itself to suit his vision. He planted trees that would outlive him. He built houses designed to host not just guests, but generations. But the roots of a family are not planted in soil or marble. They are planted in relationships, in time spent together, in honesty, in the slow, sometimes boring work of building trust and understanding between parents and children, between siblings, between one generation and the next. Those are things money can help with only indirectly. And sometimes money actually makes them harder. On Skorpios, The Onassis family never really had the chance to build that kind of rootedness. Their lives were too public, their schedules too fragmented, their emotional wounds too deep. By the time the island was ready to be a true home, the people it was meant for were either gone or unable to stay. So what does Skorpios represent now? If you look at it purely from a distance, it's a case study in the life cycle of extreme wealth. A man creates a fortune in a particular industry. He converts some of that fortune into symbolic assets that show the world his status. Yachts, islands, mansions. Those assets become associated with his name, almost like characters in the story of his life. Then, as the generations pass, the ability and sometimes the desire to maintain those assets weakens. Family lines thin, heirs move away, emotionally and geographically. Eventually, the symbols are sold, repurposed, or left to decay. But if you get a little closer, Skorpios is something else too. It's a reminder that the places we build are only as stable as the people who inhabit them. You can control a lot of things when you have money. You can import sand to a rocky beach. You can build a chapel on a hill and have it photographed from every flattering angle. You can enforce privacy so strict that the rest of the world can only guess what's happening behind the gates. What you can't do is guarantee that your children will live long enough to inherit your dream. You can't control whom they'll love, how their minds will cope with the pressure, what choices they'll make when they too are trying to escape the shadows of the past. Somewhere on that island, maybe on one of the higher points where the view stretches out across the sea, you can stand and see almost the whole story laid out in front of you. To one side, you see the main house, the terraces where Onassis and Jackie posed for those famous sunlit photos. To another, you see the harbor where the Christina used to anchor, gangplank down, guests walking up in their summer clothes, ready for drinks and gossip. Farther along, you see the smaller villas, the staff buildings, the paths winding through the pines. And if you turn just right, you can see the little cemetery, almost modest compared to the scale of everything else, but heavier than any of the mansions in terms of what it holds. Think about Athena, as an adult, contemplating the future of Skorpios. Maybe she stood on one of those terraces, listening to the wind in the trees, feeling the weight of eyes that weren't even there. Greek media waiting to see what she would do, locals hoping she would return, claim her place as the heiress, invest in the island, integrate it into some new romantic vision of the Onassis legacy made modern. But she is her own person, not a character in other people's fantasies. At some point, she had to draw a line between honoring a past she barely lived and building a future that actually made sense for her. From the outside, the decision to effectively let go of Skorpios might look cold, but in a way, it could also be seen as an act of honesty. This is not my paradise, she might have thought. This is my grandfather's stage, my mother's ghost, my uncle's lost inheritance. Maybe it's better to let it pass to someone who will actually use it instead of forcing myself to play a role I don't believe in. Of course, when billions are involved, nothing is that simple. There are contracts, trusts, negotiations. There is always the question of who really benefits when a legendary asset changes hands. But at the emotional level, the core truth remains. Skorpios, as the Onassis family island, had run its course. Now, imagine the island 10, 20 years from now. The construction is finished, the resort is fully operational. Guests arrive on sleek boats, welcomed by staff trained to make everything feel seamless, effortless. They check into villas that might occupy the same footprints as the original family houses, or they stay in new suites built further inland, nestled among trees that were saplings in Onassis's time and now tower overhead. They swim in pools filtered by cutting-edge systems. They eat in restaurants where the menus are crafted by celebrity chefs, where local Greek ingredients are elevated into art on a plate. They book spa treatments, yoga sessions at dawn, trips by private boat to neighboring islands. They sit on terraces at night with a glass of wine in hand, looking out over the same sea Aristotle Onassis once looked at, but thinking about entirely different things. Somewhere close by, maybe behind a discreet gate, the cemetery remains. Perhaps staff quietly maintain it, keeping the grass cut, the marble clean, the flowers fresh. Maybe some guests, especially those who know the history, take a walk past it and feel a little shiver. Maybe others have no idea it's even there. They came for a luxury vacation, not a meditation on the impermanence of wealth. But the island remembers, not in any mystical sense, but in the way physical spaces accumulate human experience. The trees that were planted one by one now form a continuous canopy. The paths worn by the footsteps of Alexander and Christina are overlapped by the footsteps of strangers. The stones that watched Onassis's greatest triumphs and deepest sorrows now watch honeymooners, executives on retreat, influencers capturing a perfect sunset for their followers. Skorpios has moved on in a pragmatic sense, but for many people, especially those who grew up in the shadow of the Onassis myth, it will always first belong to that family that seemed to have it all. And this is where the story loops back to something all of us can understand, even if we will never own an island. Because beneath all the specifics, this is a story about how we try to make our lives solid, unshakable, secure. We buy homes, we plant trees, we strive to build something that will last longer than we do. We tell ourselves that if we work hard enough, love intensely enough, plan cleverly enough, we can bend fate just a little in our favor. Onassis did that on a monumental scale. His island was his proof that he had made it from the fire of Smyrna to the pinnacle of global wealth. And for a while, he succeeded spectacularly. But then the random cruelty of life, a plane crash, an illness, a series of personal struggles cut through the illusion of control. What remains now is not the dynasty he dreamed of, but a story. A story that makes people lean forward when they hear the name Skorpios. A story that carries within it all the elements we instinctively respond to: rise, glory, love affairs, betrayal, tragedy, and the haunting image of an empty paradise that once echoed with laughter and now, at night, is filled mostly with the sound of wind in the trees. If you ever find yourself on a boat passing near that island, you might not be able to set foot on its sand. The security teams will keep you at a respectful distance. The new owners have their own vision to protect, but you can still look. You can look at the cluster of buildings, the green slopes, the little white church. You can picture the Christina anchored there, Onassis on deck in his linen suit, Jackie stepping down the gangplank, cameras flashing from far offshore. You can picture Alexander in a small plane, banking over the water, maybe glancing down at the island that represented so much. You can see Christina, older, walking alone along the beach, her footprints washing away in the tide, wrestling with choices nobody else could make for her. And you can ask yourself a simple question. If all of this, the island, the mansions, the fame, couldn't protect them from loss, what does that tell us about what really matters? It's not a comfortable question, but it's a useful one. It reminds us that while there is nothing wrong with wanting comfort, beauty, even a bit of luxury, the real foundations of our lives are quieter. Less impressive from the outside, time spent listening to our children, conversations that go beyond surface appearances, the courage to face grief without trying to drown it in distractions. Skorpios, for all its glamour and scandal and tragedy, ends up pointing us back to something simple. In the end, we all leave behind places and stories. The places can be sold, repurposed, redecorated. The stories, those take on a life of their own. The tragic story of the Onassis Island mansions is not tragic because marble cracked or paint peeled. It's tragic because, at its core, it is about a man who tried to build a sanctuary for his family and never got to see that sanctuary do what it was meant to do. It's about a son who never got to grow old enough to decide for himself what kind of man he wanted to be. It's about a daughter who inherited the crown but not the peace, and a granddaughter who inherited the weight of all of it and chose, in her own way, to set it down. Skorpios is still there, floating in the Ionian Sea, green and beautiful, its villas and chapels catching the light in the same way they always did. But the family that gave it its mythic aura has, in a very real sense, lost it all. What remains is the echo of glasses clinking on a terrace overlooking the sea, the echo of arguments behind closed doors on hot summer nights, the echo of a father shouting in grief in a hospital corridor, realizing that no amount of money can buy back a heartbeat, the echo of a young woman signing papers that will move an island from one era to another, perhaps with a hand that trembles just slightly, knowing that the world is watching and judging a choice they do not have to live with. You don't need to own an island to hear those echoes. You just need to listen carefully the next time you walk through your own home and feel the memories there. The next time you see someone chasing security with more and more things, more and more status, and you wonder what story lies underneath that chase. Skorpios was and is a beautiful place, but the real drama was never in the stones or the trees. It was in the human hearts that tried and failed to find refuge there. And maybe that's why, even now, the story refuses to fade. Because on some level, we recognize ourselves in it. Not in the yachts or the mansions, but in the fear of losing what we love. The temptation to believe that if we just build the right walls, buy the right view, we can keep tragedy at bay. The Onassis family learned, in the hardest possible way, that we can't. That lesson lingers on that island, woven into the shade of its pines and the silence of its empty rooms. And as the sun sets over Skorpios, turning the water that deep, glowing blue, the mansions stand there still, their lights coming on one by one, not as the home of a legendary dynasty anymore, but as monuments to a dream of permanence that, like all such dreams, could never quite survive contact with the unpredictable, fragile, all too human reality of life and loss.